why the world owes the English a thank you.
England is the greatest country the world has ever seen. When we say Britain, in essence, what we're really talking about is England. Finally, we have a global language. People try to create Esperanto in an attempt to create a global language. We have it through the beauty of our simplistic English language.
On plantations in Alabama, black slaves lived 9 years longer than people in the north of England. Hi everybody, and welcome back to Nick Talks. This episode's amazing guest. It's a gentleman I've been wanting to speak to for quite a while. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, thank you for coming along to the show.
A great pleasure, Nick. I've long admired your work. I'm glad to see that your YouTube channel is also growing steadily and you've had some great guests. So I hope I live up to their standard.
I'm sure you will. I hit 35,000 subscribers last night. So considering a year ago, about 8-9 months ago, I was less than 3,000 subscribers. It's really taken off this last 8-9 months, which is down to having wonderful guests like you. Thanks for coming along. I emailed you out the blue with one question, really. That's what I want to talk about today. The one question is related to a book I'm writing at the moment. Halfway through it, it's about Anglophobia, about hatred of the English, which is really expanded now, which means hatred of the British, hatred of the Anglosphere, and basically hatred of white Europeans. That's really what that word means now. But the last chapter of the book, I wanted to explore why the world owes the English a thank you. Now, I'm not a historian. You're a recognized historian. But some of the things I can come up with would be ending the transatlantic slave trade, creating the modern world, the Industrial Revolution. We discovered so much science in this country, so much medicine. And compared to other countries across the world, I look at it and go, wow, we're special. Is that just me being an Anglophile? Is that just me exaggerating the impact of this country? Or is there something to that? Over to you.
I would tell your panel there, the UN or whatever, I would say essentially that England is the greatest country the world has ever seen. One of the two great countries of the world, the other one being what we now call modern Italy. Italy is a very modern creation, but the Italian states. But if you look at Italy and England, no two other countries have done more to create the world around us, but also to lift up humanity, not just in terms of Western civilization, in terms of the English, but also with the Italians, globally. But with the Italians, of course, they laid the foundations, not only, of course, with ancient Roman civilization, but then, of course, through the Renaissance, through art, architecture, of course, hugely influential, our notions of beauty, which are, of course, fundamentally important to the soul and to the soul of both the individual and of civilization, but also in terms of the formation of capitalism. But then England took up that mantle, and actually no country has had a greater impact on the world for good. And, I often like to say that there are essentially 10 areas in which Britain can say, well, let's say England, because when we say Britain, in essence, what we're really talking about is England. The British Constitution, it's really the English Constitution that the Scots subscribed to, essentially, that they became incorporated into. And I think one of the great problems for the English is that they have an identity crisis because the very best elements of Englishness, England's greatest achievements, have been woven up into the British national fabric. And I often say, if you go on Wikipedia, for example, and you look up some great inventors or great figures from Britain, if they're Scottish, it will say Scottish inventor. If they're English, it will say British inventor. So it's almost as if the English, who are the great success story of these islands, have been denied their own inheritance and their own source of pride. We see a lot of Celtic nationalism with the Scots and the Welsh being able to wave their flags with great gusto, and that's called progressive nationalism. When the English do it, it's racist, and I think it's high time that the English reclaimed their identity, and that means taking pride in some of the things that I'm going to tell you now, which are the top 10 for me are, yes, you already mentioned one, the Industrial Revolution. We'll go into all these in depth later on, but the Industrial Revolution. Number two is the creation of the railways and modern public mass transit as we understand it today, both in the city level and globally, which shrank the world. Parliamentary democracy spreading around the globe. Capitalism, we didn't invent that. As I said, that was an Italian invention, and then the Dutch put steroids on it, but nobody did more to spread capitalism around the world than the British. And then English liberty. And English liberty is very different to Greco-Roman concepts of liberty, is different to continental types of liberty. English liberty has probably been, many would argue, perhaps our greatest contribution to the world in philosophical notions, especially with this idea of the rights of Englishmen. The English language, which we ironically call the lingua franca, I think it should be called the lingua anglia now. Finally, we have a global language. People try to create Esperanto in an attempt to create a global language. We have it through the beauty of our simplistic English language. The common law legal system is another hugely important one. Then the British Empire. The British Empire, fundamentally important in shaping the world as we know it, which led to things like the abolition of slavery, along with many other abhorrent practices, but also led to the development of the world and the spreading of many of these great gifts of England that I've already mentioned. Then English Protestantism, so Anglicanism, Methodism, Quakerism, the Salvation Army. English Protestantism was hugely important in shaping notions of the individual. The most individualistic nations in the world are the Anglosphere nations. America, Canada, Australia, the UK, and New Zealand. Those are the most individualistic countries in the world. And a lot of the success and genius of the Anglosphere nations comes from English Protestantism, which we can also get into later. And then, of course, finally, I would say something which we often forget, and that's sport. The notion of sport, essentially the majority, almost every single modern sport of today that one can think of was an English creation, with the exception of golf and curling, which of course come from the Scots. And it's quite remarkable. And of course, these sports have now become global phenomenon. They unite the world, and sport is one of the great things that brings the people of a nation together, forges social cohesion around the world. And that's another aspects of England's global inheritance, or for which we can all take pride in. And those are the top 10, I would say, pillars of England's great gift to the world. And I don't think any other country can come close to matching that sort of great legacy. And then further from that, we can also look and see who are the figures in England's history that we can look to as being truly significant on a global level. And I would say that England can lay claim to the two most influential figures in human history after Jesus Christ. And that's Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. Newton, of course, the key figure in the scientific revolution, with his Principium Mathematica, of course, hugely important book in which he unified physics and classical mechanics and formulated the laws we know about gravity and motion and all of that, which stayed in place until Einstein's theory of relativity. And really, Newton created the scientific method by which the whole world has been improved. And of course, Charles Darwin, one of the great figures in human history, who of course developed this whole concept of the evolution of the species and survival of the fittest and all of that. So, those are the two greatest figures after Jesus Christ who shaped the world. Then you get just a step down from that, other completely fascinating and fundamental global figures, people like John Maynard Keynes for economics, with state intervention, concepts of economics from Keynes, which became globally significant. I mean, I think his works probably are the most famous works in economics are his, whether you agree with them or not. The General Theory of Employment, the book he wrote there. Then Locke, of course, the very notion of classical liberalism that the world understands, he gave birth to that, the concept that, each man has a right to life, liberty, and property, that the government mustn't interfere with those rights, that essentially governments govern with the consent of the people, and therefore the authority of government derives from the people, from the ground up. And finally, who's left? Oh, yes, Edmund Burke, and the idea of of traditional conservatism. So Locke on the liberal side, Burke on the conservative side, and here's a concept of traditional conservatism which shapes conservatism around the world: respect for institutions and tradition, in essentially guiding society and guiding people, and being opposed to radicalism, and essentially understanding that the society develops organically, not through revolution and so forth. So taken together, I think that's a pretty potent and compelling argument for England being the greatest nation we've seen.
Well, you're going to get no argument from me, Rafe. No argument whatsoever. So you've just backed up my instincts, my thoughts, and my limited reading on the history of this island. Let me put this to you. So in a unreality, which we're living in unreality now, so this could actually come true. King Charles is arrested by the United Nations. He's taken to The Hague and he's put on trial for the crimes of England. He needs some help. So he looks on his phone, the internet's down, but he sees Peter Whittle online. So he contacts Peter Whittle from the New Culture Forum and he says, Peter, send me someone to help me. And Peter goes, I've got the man here. He's called Rafe. He buys you a first class ticket to Amsterdam. You fly over to Holland and then you go and represent King Charles in the dock in The Hague. And the question put to you on behalf of the king is this: what has England done to improve the world? Because we've got a list here of everything evil, nasty, incompetent that England have done. They bought slaves. They actually paid slave owners to free their slaves. Didn't give the money to the slaves. They fought wars. They let millions of Bengalis starve to death. They let Irish people starve to death in the potato famine. English people are the most evil in the world. We put this to you, Rafe. How can you explain this? What have they done apart from evil? How would you answer that question when you're stood in The Hague representing the King of England?
Sure. Well, I've already given you 10 ways in which that's happened. We can go into some of those in a bit, but just to do defense before we do offense, to defend the reputation of England against these vile calumnies on slavery, for example, the facts are very simple. Slavery was universal. Slavery, they often said that prostitution is the oldest career in the world. Well, slavery and prostitution are the two oldest things in the world. Slavery goes back tens of thousands of years. England was participating in slavery for a very short period of time in comparison to all of that, a couple of 100 years. But what is unique about England, the British Empire, is that the British Empire and Western Europe became engulfed and enveloped by this Christian, the idea of Christian missionary zeal and Christian morality. And that Christian ethic that went through the British Empire in the second half was all about atoning for the sins of the first half of the British Empire. And Britain became the first country in the world to deliberately make itself poorer in order to achieve a moral good. Not only the abolition of the slave trade and the freeing of the slaves, but an enforcement of the abolition of the slave trade globally. No other country in the world had made itself poorer to achieve something that wasn't in its own economic best interest. So what did we see? We saw Britain paying a sum of £20 million. I forget now how it was. It was a huge chunk, 43% of annual GDP, to free the slaves, a sum equivalent to, I think, £20 billion today. Now, yes, you could say, well, look, why was that money paid to the slave owners? It's very clear. We have to talk about realpolitik. This was a time of the rotten boroughs. Britain was one of the world's most democratic countries back in 1807 and 1833, but it was far from perfect. You had rotten boroughs, you still had corruption in government, far less than elsewhere in the world, but it was still present at that time. In order to get the freedom of the slaves, you had to do deals with the slave owners and with their powerful lobby in Parliament. The slaves would never have been freed had that money not been paid to the slave owners. So you can take a moral high ground and say, we're not going to pay the slave owners, but that would have meant that the slaves wouldn't have been free. So that's the point to make on that front. Secondly, the British then went on to spend a sum equivalent to 2% of their GDP, which is the sum equivalent to our modern defense budget. They were spending our entire defense budget on the West Africa Squadron, which was the Royal Navy squadron that sailed the seas fearlessly at huge cost of resources, huge cost of sailors' lives, to enforce and enter the slave trade on the seas. That meant also seizing foreign ships, including American ships that were engaged in slavery. Also included, of course, the British going inland into Africa to enforce and enter the slave trade, because, as we well know, the people who were most resistant to the abolition of slavery were Africans, because Africans were enslaving other Africans. Europeans didn't enslave any Africans. Europeans moored their ships off of the coast of West Africa and bought slaves from the slave markets that were built on the coast. The slaves came as war booty, as prisoners or whatever from other Africans. And never forget, more Africans were held in slavery by other Africans in Africa than ever sailed over the oceans. We never hear anything about that. And it seems as if always this list of crimes that you often hear from people on the left, the crimes that you are hypothetically laying for King Charles to explain, these always seem to be crimes solely laid at the feet of the British and the Americans, and to a lesser extent other people in the West. And that's why there's actually none of these claims of crimes are actually about justice or morality. These are all ways of undermining Britain and the West, because actually Britain and America have a far greater record on these things than comparable countries within Europe, or particularly outside Europe.
No, absolutely. I've wrote some articles on the West African Squadron, written some articles on African slavery. There's more African slaves alive today than ever before in the history of mankind.
That's right. There are 7 in every 1,000 Africans today, according to the International Labour Organization, is a slave. That's 10 million people. CNN says that hundreds of slaves are sold every week in Libya. There are hundreds of thousands of slaves in individual countries. Pakistan is the global center of slavery. Yet none of that is ever mentioned. That's how you know this isn't about slavery, because if it was, the people who are championing this cause would be protesting outside those embassies and those governments. The fact that they're silent about the plight of modern slaves today, which is really far more important, tells you all you need to know about their true motivations.
No, I agree. So another charge that could be put against the King of England would be this: your empire where the sun never set, was the most evil, corrupt, violent empire ever to exist. When you compare it to other empires that have been, how would you answer that?
I would laugh in their face for about 30 seconds. Once I had wiped the tears away from my eyes, I would then ask them to point out which empires are they comparing the British Empire to, because by every comparison, the British Empire, which of course committed horrors and wrongs, no one is to deny that. And that's one of the points here. This is not a situation where you can say the British Empire was entirely good or entirely bad. The problem is all of the framing, all of the narratives we're getting is that the British Empire was not only all bad, it was uniquely bad, and there was nothing ever like, which is complete nonsense. Yes, there were some undoubted things, bad things that happened, but when you compare the British Empire to all the other empires, not only the European, the terrible Spanish or the Portuguese or whatever, but if you look at the Mughal Empire in India, you look at all these other empires, the British Empire was the most benign. And what's remarkable about the British Empire, the largest territorial empire the world has ever seen, was how few British armed forces were used to keep it in check. In fact, the British were able to rule without the iron fist and the brutality that you saw in other empires. They did that through a whole variety of means, often working with the Indians, for example, with the Maharajas to rule and so forth. So it's remarkable how good that was. But also the benefits that the British Empire brought, the life expectancy of Aborigines in Australia almost doubled. For tens of thousands of years it had been 40. Today it's 70 years, right? You look at not only the abolition of slavery, but the other abhorrent cultural practices that the British outlawed in India that included banning sutti, the burning of Hindu widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands, passing laws to ban infanticide, the murder of young girls, allowing Hindu women to remarry, ending headhunting in New Zealand, included things like ending female genital mutilation. So many things were done by the British to try to actually, and also women's rights in general. I mean, we look at people like Indira Gandhi in India and the rise of women in politics in the third world, in Asia and Africa and elsewhere. That's because of the British Empire and the institutions that the British Empire laid down. Does anyone seriously think that women would be so powerful in, Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan or so forth? Were it not for the British Empire, women's rights became so much more safeguarded because of the British. But then just think wherever you go in the world, whichever region of the world you go to, those countries that were formerly British colonies are the most successful, the most democratic, the most stable, and usually the most wealthy. And that's because of their colonial inheritance brought to them by the British Empire. That's the common law, that's the English language, that's the parliamentary system of legislatures, that's the rule of law, that's the army structures that were left there, that's the police, that's the civil service, that's the railways, the hospitals. Don't forget the universities that educated generations in the British tradition. Don't forget things like the Indian civil service. The India was run by Indians. The Indian civil service hugely important. And compare that to when the French and the Spanish and others left their colonies without any of those stable infrastructure and framework by comparison. So I think by every and of course having the English language, having the common law enables these countries to become global players on the global stage. And so I think by every measure, I would say, yes, there are negatives there. But if you want to put them on the balance sheet, I think you'll see that the British Empire was undoubtedly far more good than bad and far greater and better than any other empire. And sorry, and one last point to make on that. It's fascinating, You go to the British Museum, you watch the BBC, and you get the same thing about the British Empire being horrific and horrendous. Now, the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum currently, and the BBC last year both had an exhibition and documentary on the glories of the Mughal Empire of India, celebrating its achievements. Now, you couldn't imagine them celebrating the British Empire's achievements in art and architecture, but they did that on the Mughal Empire, an empire that killed, slaughtered, and tortured millions of Hindus, Sikhs, and Jains in the most savage ways, tying Sikhs and Hindus' heads to cannons, and blowing them off, burning them in vats of oil. Yet that is excused and ignored as our British institutions celebrate their art and architecture. The British Empire did nothing like that, and yet you would never see the BBC or the V&A celebrating the glorious achievements of the culture of the British Empire, which again, I say, speaks volumes. This is all about undermining Britain and the West.
The next question The Hague would put to you, Rafe, would be this. Those countries under the British Empire finally gained the strength to kick out the English. And because the English didn't like that, they then forced all those countries to join something called the Commonwealth of Nations. So the English could still control those nations, but in a sneaky sort of way.
Well, that's a very novel idea, given that the poor Commonwealth nations receive a disproportionate amount of the aid that Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand give a share around the globe. Look, again, one of the great arguments to demonstrate how benign the British Empire was the fact that you had peaceful paths to independence. You didn't have the scenes we saw, for example, in Algeria when the French were trying to maintain control of Algeria, for example, or what you saw with the Dutch and others. The British Empire, of course, there were obviously acts of disobedience and skirmishes, but the manner in which the British Empire was able to go from becoming an empire into a Commonwealth is a testament to the fact that the overwhelming majority of the colonies, of the people in the colonies, didn't want to have a revolution and throw off their colonial inheritance. They just wanted to run it themselves. And that shows you how great the British Empire was, because if it had been a brutal, oppressive force, then they would have thrown off all of that and reverted to their previous ways, precisely as we saw in the Soviet Empire. When the Soviet Empire collapsed, what was the first thing that the Poles and Bulgarians and Czechs and Romanians did? It was to flee into the arms of Western Europe and to restore their old flags, restore their old coats of arms, their old honors systems, and essentially purge themselves of every aspect of the Soviet rule. By contrast, all that happened in the British Empire was that they replaced a picture of, they replaced the Governor General with the President. All the institutions, same, the buildings, same, the same. Yes, they got new flags and things, but they were still, but many of the Commonwealth realms continued to have, they opted to have the sovereign, the British monarch. Elizabeth II, they kept that sovereign in power. They kept the House of Lords, the Judicial Council of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as the last Supreme Court for their countries. And there was a huge admiration. They still sent their children to be educated in the British education system, and lawyers coming from the Inns of Court in London. And the idea now that you have this voluntary association, if you're fleeing an abuser, you don't go back into a voluntary association. And I think that speaks volumes about the true nature of the British relationship with the colonies. And of course, the warm relationship that Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had with her Commonwealth leaders. They didn't regard her with disdain. They had a very warm relationship, and that's one of the marked things about the last 50 years post-Empire.
So the UN or The Hague would put this to you next. That's okay, Rafe. We feel you're cherry picking now from many, many history books, and unfortunately, we're not that educated to be able to challenge any of your points because we tend not to read. But let me put this to you, because this is indisputable now. England became a wealthy nation and a world leader and a powerhouse because it raped, it pillaged, and it stole wealth from across the world. That's the only reason why England is a first world nation. They stole it from other poorer nations.
Oh, 2 points to that, right? Firstly, it's undoubtedly the case that Britain did achieve some wealth through the ability to trade with the empire. No one's denying that. But let's look at it this way. Firstly, there's an argument put forward that slavery somehow fueled the Industrial Revolution. This is something you hear very often. Were it not for the slave trade, Britain wouldn't have become this powerhouse and wouldn't have become an economic giant through the Industrial Revolution. I'm sorry, the only reason Britain was able to embark upon a successful slave trade was because it was already a rich country. Having a global slave trade it happens to countries that are already rich. If slavery was the necessary jet fuel to start to ignite the Industrial Revolution, then why didn't it happen in Africa? There were more slaves held in Africa than anywhere else. How come they didn't become the first to industrialize? What about on a closer to home? Why didn't the Spanish or Portuguese become the first industrial nations? In fact, they became economic backwaters. Yet they were involved in slavery before the British and had comparable sized hordes of slaves. Similarly, how come countries like Germany and Switzerland and Sweden were able to industrialize, given that they didn't have a global slave trade? So, I mean, the arguments there are very silly. In 1792 was the top year for sugar trading. Now, sugar was the main reason for slavery within the British Empire. In America, it was cotton and so forth. But Britain, it was sugar. Now, in 1792, capital formation for sugar was only 3%. In other words, only 3% of investment was going in of British investment was going into sugar. If sugar and slavery was such a hugely important part of the British economy, they should have had 30% of investment going in there rather than only 3%. In fact, if you look at the impact of slavery on the English economy, it's essentially the same as was contributed by barley and hops. And nobody I've heard has said that beer fueled the Industrial Revolution, and yet they were entirely comparable. Yes, look, slavery made some slave owners hugely wealthy, and that's where the confusion lies, because if you go around England, you will see these grand stately homes which look very impressive. You'll see universities or museums founded with the philanthropy of the wealthy slave owners, but that's on an individual level. In terms of the national wealth, that money was inconsequential. It wasn't hugely important. Another point here, more broadly, aside from slavery, often people will talk about, for example, India and the fact that India had a share. And I forget the exact figures here, but I'm just making this up now. But India had 40% of global GDP was Indian before the British arrived. After the British left, India's GDP had collapsed to a very small percentage of global GDP. And somehow they're doing this correlation as causation. But that's not correct. What happened was the rest of the world's economies grew, and so proportionally, of course, the size of the Indian economy fell. In the same way, in the 1950s, the United States of America's global share of GDP was vastly higher than it is now. Now, is someone saying that America is a victim of colonization and somehow America has been pilfered by the global economies? No, it's just a fact that China and India and other countries have risen, and that's lowered America's global share of GDP. Another way to also look at it, one of the things that is often said is that 43 trillion, I think it's $43 trillion was stolen from India by the British. That was put out by a rather ridiculous Marxist historian. It's been completely blown out of the water by serious Indian economists who've looked into all of this in great detail and far better qualified than I. But essentially, what they say is, well, firstly, that number is completely nonsensical. There's no justification for that number whatsoever. But most importantly, what they looked at was, well, the money leaving India, which went to Britain, for example, would that money have necessarily stayed in India had the British not been there? So they looked at what the Maharajas were doing, because India was only governed partly by the British. There were other parts of India the British weren't governing. They were governed by the Maharajas. And there's no actual difference in the amount of money that was being invested in the Indian economy by the Maharajas before the British arrived or after the British arrived. So you actually can't make that argument.
There's two things I found out recently about slavery, which you'll probably already know. The first one was, if you look at America, you split America in half. Northern America, as in the United States of America, the northern part didn't have any slaves, and they were industrialized, the big cities. And then you have, the southern states, which were heavily used slavery. And then you ask yourself, which was the richest part of America, United States of America? It was the northern part, because they industrialized. Slavery wasn't the panacea to wealth that we think it was. It kept people only at a certain level of wealth, where technology innovation pushed people even further, and hence why the North won the Civil War. They had the Civil War. Yeah. And the second thing I learned recently was, at the height of the American slave trade, on plantations in Alabama, Black slaves lived 9 years longer than people in the north of England. That's how tough it was in the north of England compared to being a slave on a plantation. No way am I saying it was good to be a slave. I'm just saying everybody had it bad in most places across the world.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is why the call for reparations from Britain is so nonsensical and so unjust, because we had a Caribbean judge who sat on the International Criminal Court. He was one of the International Court of Justice, rather. He was one of the guys who ruled on the Chagos Islands. He was the one who put together this report, this panel that said Britain should pay, I think it was $18 trillion in reparations for slavery, which is more than the entire GDP of China, we somehow managed to find down the back of the sofa. But he wants British taxpayers to pay that. Now, why should British taxpayers pay slavery reparations when, out of a population of millions, there were only a few thousand slave owners? The vast majority of people living in England descend from people who lived lives of abject poverty akin to serfdom, exactly, not that far off from slavery. Horrific conditions, horrific lives. So why should their descendants pay reparations to people in the Caribbean and people in the Americas, where, quite frankly, you can't even prove that they necessarily descended from the slaves? But there's no fairness and no justice there whatsoever. On the contrary, as abhorrent as slavery was, and slavery was absolutely horrific. And if slaves were alive today, then we should absolutely pay reparations to them because they are the living victims. But the great, 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 great grandchildren of slaves are not victims at all. In fact, the richest element of the black diaspora are African Americans. People living in America who are black are the wealthiest black people in the world, closely followed by Canadian black people and black people living in the UK. By every measure you look at, the lives of the descendants of slaves today are far better than if their ancestors had never left Africa.
Yeah, I completely agree. If someone has to pay reparations, it should be the descendants of the African kings who sold their brothers, sisters, cousins, and neighbors into slavery in the first place. For me, the buck stops there.
Yeah, and if the English slave owning families want to give some of their wealth, that's up to them, but it's not for the British taxpayer to pay any of that.
No, absolutely not. So my final question is this. So at The Hague, you won your case. King Charles has now been released. He's back on the throne in London. He's a very happy chappy. Because The Hague and the UN had no rebuttal to any of your information then once they looked in the history books. But now that we're back in England and we're trying to work out now, why did this happen? Why did the world, what perceived to be the world, turn on England, turn on the English, and try to make us out to be the most evil race in the world, where the history books say we've done some evil things like everybody else, but when you want to rate evilness, we're at the bottom of that list about how evil we were compared to everybody else. Why has that happened? My theory in the book I'm writing, one of the chapters is on jealousy and envy. And I've come to the conclusion that every country, so they can cope with their ancestral failures, when they compare themselves to other continents, other countries, they go, my ancestors weren't as good as your ancestors. You did not achieve this, meaning the Europeans, the English, you didn't achieve this by yourselves. You cheated. You had to cheat. Otherwise, it means my ancestors weren't good enough. So therefore, they're looking for excuses to blame somebody else about why they're not first world countries. Is there any merit to that?
Absolutely. No, it's a multifaceted explanation as to why this is the case, and in essence, Britain is caught in a pincer movement between those very things you've just spoken about, the external bad faith actors, but also we've got the internal bad faith actors, the radical left, who have marched through all of our institutions and captured it, and are now perpetuating a very anti-British, anti-Western Marxist philosophy that you now see emanating through all of our media, our museums, our schools, and so forth, preaching all of this. Now, they're doing it for a very specific reason, but let's focus firstly on what you're talking about here. And yes, it's undeniable. What you see very often is when you look at outcomes, when you look at productivity, when you look at the health of these countries around the world, they will say, well, it's because of the British Empire that we're in this state. And had it not been for the British Empire, we would have developed and advanced perhaps to the same levels that you're at. To which the answer is quite simple. The British didn't actually arrive in Africa, for example, until the 19th century. Now, Africa is the oldest part of the world in terms of populations. Why in the first few thousand years was there no development of the sort that you saw happening in Europe? You can't suddenly look at the last 200 years when your civilizations go back thousands of years. It is quite often envy and jealousy, as you say, and embarrassment that their cultures haven't been able to develop along anywhere near the same sort of lines. That also applies to Asia. Asia has been the cradle of civilization for thousands of years. Britain and the West were absolute backwaters for thousands of years. It's only since the 1700s that Europe could really claim to be the most important part of the world. Prior to the 1700s, in terms of wealth and everything else, it was India and Asia that were, light years ahead of Europe economically and militarily and so forth. It was only really with the start of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, and then finally with the Industrial Revolution, that you saw that changing. And now it seems, of course, as if the pendulum is going back. When you look at the economic growth and so forth, it does seem as if after 250 years, where the Britain and the West changed the entire globe, advanced the world, improved the lot of lives everywhere, the center of power is moving back to Asia, to China and India and so forth. But I think it's embarrassing for those countries who've always been at the forefront of the world to explain the last 250 years, where actually they were taken over by leaps and bounds by Europe. But also in terms of current politics and the current leaders of many of these countries around the world, it's far easier for them to explain their failures today, their failures in university education, their failure in healthcare, their failure to look after their people, the high mortality rates, the low life expectancy, along all those levels. It's far easier to blame colonialism and Britain for these things rather than acknowledge that actually it's because of their inability to govern effectively. And you just have to look at places like South Africa, for example, which was the jewel in the crown of Africa for the last few decades. In the last 20 years, since the end of white rule there, let's put it quite plainly, you can see how South Africa has succumbed to corruption and to a complete deterioration and degradation of all of its public institutions. And it's quite a sorry state to see, even just on the physical level, the deterioration of streets and buildings.
Absolutely. It's about culture and it's about leadership. Let me give you this example. Jamaica and Singapore are basically the same size. There's only one difference between those two countries. Jamaica has natural resources. Singapore has no natural resources. And both of them were ruled by the British Empire, created by the British Empire, and ruled by the British Empire. And look at Singapore today compared to Jamaica. That was all about culture and it's all about leadership. Nothing to do with empire, nothing to do with anything else. It's to do with who comes after and the dreams and the aspirations those people have.
Yeah, and Singapore is a very good example. Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, he came to London shortly after the Second World War in the 1940s, and he went for a walk, and he went through Trafalgar Square, and he was amazed to see an honesty box. There were a pile of newspapers in Trafalgar Square. People would come, take a paper, and leave a coin in the box. And he thought, gosh, that could only happen in Britain and Europe. I want to create that sort of disciplined, well-ordered society of high social trust. I want to create that in Singapore. But to do that, I need to have strict discipline, strict laws, the most draconian type of state, in order to inculcate these values into a society and a culture that isn't used to that. And he succeeded. And that's why Singapore now is the great powerhouse that it is, why it's probably the safest country or one of the safest countries in the world to live, one of the most well-ordered, high levels of social trust. If you drop your wallet, you'll probably find it there the next day, if not the next week. It hasn't gone into a police station. And it used to be cheekily, but now not so cheekily. I now rather think that, he wanted to make Singapore like Britain. I think now we need to make Britain like Singapore. And I think perhaps we need to have some more draconian legislation and discipline and rules in this country to make Britain Britain again, to coin a sort of phrase there. And, in Singapore, you get caned, you get judicial caning if you have antisocial behavior and everything else. And quite often I wonder in this country whether, we've lost all sense of control over the more feral elements of our society who just laugh if they get a prison sentence or a fine or an ASBO. Maybe we need to think about judicial caning and other things to bring back some sense of civility to our streets.
I agree, but let's be honest. I don't think you could have honesty boxes in any of our cities anymore now.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah, they're actually failing in the countryside because the visitors steal everything and take the money and take the products. Honesty boxes now have completely gone across the UK. And that's because we now live in a low trust society. And we've imported people from different cultures. And it's not just them. English white people do this as well now because they all look out for themselves. Now, the reason why Singapore became extremely successful on the back of him looking at honesty boxes is because if you want a successful society and you want to trade, you've got to believe the person you're trading with has got the best intentions. You've got to believe they're not a crook. You've got to believe they will live up to what they say they're going to do. That's how we trade. If I think you're a crook or most of you are crooks, I don't trade with you. So therefore, trading doesn't become normal and nobody gets rich because we don't trust each other. That's the big success story of Singapore, is believing in each other and trusting each other.
That's right. Well, what Singapore has done is it's tried to create artificially what Western Europe developed naturally or organically, and that's what we call high trust societies. Now, high levels of social trust, people need to understand social trust isn't just about, whether you can trust somebody in a deal or whatever. It's whether you can, if there's a water shortage in your neighborhood, do you have the trust that your neighbors will actually not be watering their gardens or not flouting any laws? It's that fundamental idea of social trust, which you only get when well, let me put it this way. Well, every indication is that the higher the level of social trust, the greater the economic prosperity and the economic performance of a community or of a country. And the lower the level of social trust, the lower the economic productivity, but also the lower the social cohesion. And there's been granular research looking at this on a local neighborhood level. And what happens is people become more introverted. The more ethnic diversity you get in a local community, the more social trust declines, the more people stay at home, watch television rather than engaging. You see a deterioration of community spaces, gardens, squares, playgrounds, buildings begin to deteriorate. By every level, you see that without social trust, society as a whole begins to deteriorate. And there was a big meta-analysis done of this by Danish or Dutch sociologists looking at all 87 studies on social trust, and they saw by every measure, once you lose social trust, that means that your society as a whole begins to disintegrate. And that's precisely what we're seeing happening in our societies today. And in fact, within Europe, the areas with most homogeneity, the areas with least immigration, have the highest levels of social trust and are far more productive. And it goes beyond that. So if you look at Scandinavia, for example, we all celebrate Sweden and Denmark and so forth for their great social democracy. Everyone's looked after with great pensions and great welfare systems. The more immigration you get into an area, the less homogeneity, the lower the social trust, the less willing people are to pay high taxes for welfare schemes and all of this. So it's a fundamental cancer at the heart of our society, is the degradation of levels of social trust.
We forget sometimes that we're actually tribal creatures, and hence why we have phrases like birds of a feather stick together, because innately we want to be with people like us. And when we're surrounded by people who are not like us, it brings to the fore those feelings of tribalism, that it's my people first. And we see that across many of our towns and cities in the UK. Let's end on this final question. You may or may not have an answer to this. Are you optimistic? Are you optimistic that England, Britain can get through the issues we're going through now? Do you foresee a change? I'm very optimistic. I think change is coming. I look at Western Europe, I look at America. I'm not sure how the change will come. I'm not sure what form it will take, but I know what we've got at the moment can't continue because no one's happy. I smell violence in the air coming down the path. Our politicians at the moment are incompetent, and I don't think they're good enough to deal with this. But I'm hoping when this Labour government fails the next couple of years, the next government, the next set of politicians, people getting into politics now, hopefully are the ones who can solve some of our problems. What do you think? What do you feel?
Well, I know what needs to be done. The question is there the will within any of the current political parties to actually do what needs to be done? Not to talk the talk, because we've had that for 14 years, Tory rule, People are very good at talking the talk and sounding tough, getting the sound bites, getting the headlines in the tabloid red tops. And unfortunately, a lot of the public buy into the spin, but the reality is very scant evidence of that on the ground. Look, what we're seeing in America with Trump in terms of mass deportations and on immigration and all that front, that's changing the Overton window, I think, within Europe. We're also seeing, of course, the Danes, the Swedes, the Dutch, the Hungarians, the Finns, all getting much stricter on immigration. The Germans have basically closed the Schengen. The Poles have been allowed not to allow any more asylum seekers in there. Britain's an outlier still. Britain is to the left of all of this. Even the Reform Party is to the left of mainstream politicians in Europe when it comes to things like mass deportations and remigration, which I think has to be. I will only be optimistic if a political party in this country embraces the politics of mass deportation of illegal immigrants, firstly, but also do what the Swedes are doing, and that's voluntary remigration of naturalized citizens and potentially British-born citizens. The Swedes essentially are offering a sum equivalent to £30,000 per person to leave the country and never come back. And if you're a family of 5 or whatever, that's a lot of money to set up a new life in Africa or Asia or wherever. And we know in this country, for example, that the vast majority, I mean, the overwhelming majority of the immigrants to this country have been low-skilled immigrants who, by the time that they reach pension age, cost us £151,000 each. If they live to 80, each one costs £434,000 or £464,000 each. So paying £30,000 at the outset to remove them from the country, where they would have to revoke their citizenship, renounce their citizenship, and not come back. But unless you embrace a policy of mass deportations, unless you embrace remigration, it's very hard for me to see how England can be saved. Because, as you say, this is all about social trust. This is all about social cohesion. This is not against immigration. Immigration is fine. The levels we had in the 80s and 90s was 50,000 a year. Perfectly fine, easy to absorb. We've now getting immigration, of 1.2 million gross, more immigration last year than in the 80s and 90s combined, more immigration in the last 25 years than in the last 2,000 years combined. No society can withstand that, particularly when they're coming from completely incompatible cultures with abhorrent cultural practices, as we're seeing with rape gangs and honor killings and acid attacks, forced marriages, child marriages, everything else. So until we basically roll back our population demographics to where they were, let's say in 2010, then I think we can't be optimistic. But if we can do that, then we have every reason to be optimistic.
And I think we're just praying that someone comes along, a little bit like Thatcher in the 70s, someone comes along who will take on the establishment, who will do the things that we've been told all our lives can't be done. Because Trump's doing it, and some European countries are doing it. It can be done. It just needs the will and a backbone. Do we have people like that left in our country? We don't know. But I think we've been through worse situations than this before. And I'm very hopeful an Englishman or an Englishwoman will come along. Cometh the hour, cometh the man, cometh the woman.
Yes, we're Churchill 2.0. Where are you?
Rafe, thank you so much for spending your time talking to me today. Some of this conversation will go in my new book. It'll help frame my last chapter. I really appreciate it. Thank you, and let's speak again soon.
A great pleasure. Thanks so much, Nick. Best of luck with the book.
Thank you.